Natsu Dragneel, the lovable main male protagonist within the anime and manga series of Fairy Tail. Within the story of Fairy Tail, Natsu's existence alone has had an enormous effect on the way which the story has gone, and overall, when it does come down to it, whether you hate Natsu or you love Natsu, Fairy Tail would not have been the same without him, and that is a fact. However, one of the biggest things that surrounds the story of Fairy Tail at this current point in time, surrounding Natsu's character specifically, is the fact that over 400 years ago, him along with his mother and father were slayed by a dragon who ravaged his village, leaving only his brother Zeref to tell the tale, and leaving Zeref, who's actually the one to resurrect Natsu. Now, as I stated before, we all know how big of an impact Natsu's life has had within the story of Fairy Tail, both negative and positive to a certain extent, but when it does come down to it, if it weren't for the dragon that came and ravaged Natsu's village, who in the end killed Natsu, and when Zeref revived Natsu, then it's likely Natsu would have lived a normal life, and if that were to be the case, then the entire Fairy Tail story would be completely shifted in another direction. So what if Natsu never died over 400 years ago due to the dragon ravaging his village? Let's go ahead and start with how this would have affected the people who actually lived around Natsu's time over 400 years ago, starting with Natsu's elder brother, Zeref Dragneel. Now, over 400 years ago when the dragon came and ravaged the village, then in return killed Natsu and his parents, Zeref was the only one to survive. And we all know that following this, Zeref actually went to an academy where he actually learned how to utilize various forms of black magic. And later on, with the help of the studies that he learned at the academy, Zeref went on to become one of the most notorious and known dark mages. One of these studies that he studied at the academy being a study centered around the process of resurrecting the dead. Zeref would later on go to resurrect his beloved brother Natsu Dragneel. However, in return, he had to pay a hefty price, that price being his mortality. Zeref, from this point on, lived a life where he was completely immortal, meaning that Zeref could not die. This being due to the Angstrom curse, otherwise known as a contradictory curse, a curse that caused Zeref to become immortal following the resurrection of his beloved younger brother Natsu. However, if Natsu never died in the first place, then it's likely that none of this would have ever taken place, arguably for the most part. Now, you could argue that Zeref may still have the ambition for black magic that he did in the normal timeline. However, I do believe that along with many, that his ambition to learn this stemmed from his desire to resurrect his younger brother Natsu Dragneel. Nevertheless, Natsu and Zeref, along with their parents, likely would have lived in a normal life from that point on, meaning that Zeref would have likely died over 400 years ago along with his younger brother Natsu. And this as well means that it's likely that the 400-year plan, the plan that Zeref and his accomplice, none other than Lucy's ancestor Anna Heartfilia, devised to slay the beast known to many as Acnologia, likely would have never been a plan that came to fruition to begin with. Again, you could argue that Zeref would have still been alive enough to put his plan to action. However, the likelihood of all that is very, very slim. And speaking of the future, let's go and talk about the differences that we likely see within the present time in regards to the story of Fairy Tail. Now, for starters, Fairy Tail the Guild itself, yeah, you can kiss the guild goodbye because there's almost no way whatsoever that Fairy Tail would exist in the first place if Natsu had never died. Very soon after being cursed with the Angstrom curse and enacting the 400-year plan alongside his accomplice Anna Heartfilia, who was Lucy's ancestor, Zeref began to lead a life where he simply wandered around waiting for the day that he'd come into contact with his beloved brother Natsu once more. However, during this time he actually came into contact with a young girl named Mavis who had aspirations to form a guild with her newfound friends that she met on her homeland of Tenro Island. And with this, Zeref actually agreed to teach her and her friends magic, and fast forward from that point on, you had the formation of the guild known by all, Fairy Tail. However, none of this would have happened if Natsu had never died over 400 years ago, seeing as Zeref likely himself wouldn't be around when Mavis had the aspiration of creating a guild, seeing as Zeref himself would have likely died many centuries prior to this moment. Not only that though, but on the topic of Mavis, not only would Mavis have not been affected by the same curse that Zeref was affected by, that being the Angstrom curse, but alongside that, Mavis would have never died to the hands of Zeref, seeing as the two would have never met to begin with. So Mavis would have likely lived a life either on Tenro or exploring with her newfound friends at the time. Now, quickly venturing back once again 400 years in the past, within recent chapters of Fairy Tail, we actually found out that Urza's mother, Eileen Belsirion, was actually the sole creator of Dragon Slayer magic, and as well, at one point, was turned into a dragon, and as a repercussion for using such magic, the magic of a Dragon Slayer. And after turning into a dragon, she actually ventured out for the cure to this unwanted form of hers, and one day, she came across a wandering Zeref Dragneel who granted her with her centuries-long wish of being human once again. Not completely human, but it was close close enough with him gifting her the mere physique of a human once again after many years of her being a dragon. However, if Natsu had never died, then much like Natsu, Zeref would have died many years ago, and in return, likely causing e.n.d to actually remain a dragon for many more years on end, and possibly for the remainder of her lifetime, seeing as she would have never really came across someone, or could have never come across someone with the abilities that Zeref had that would have been capable of granting her with such a wish, the wish to be a human once again. And if this were to be the case, seeing as Urza was in e.n.d's womb for the entire time that e.n.d was a dragon, it's possible that Urza would have never been birthed into the world by e.n.d, seeing as e.n.d would have simply remained a dragon forever. However, let's just say that Urza was miraculously brought into the world some way, somehow. Maybe it's because she's Urza, but nevertheless, it's likely that her life would have followed in the same path up until the point where her mother e.n.d abandoned her at Rosemary Village. However, from this point on, Urza's life would have been drastically different from the life that we know Urza had now. For starters, Urza would have likely remained at Rosemary for at least the remainder of her childhood years, growing up in the village, and let me tell you why. The only reason why Urza was kidnapped from Rosemary in the first place was to rebuild the R system, a system that's end goal was to revive Zeref. However, if Natsu and Zeref hadn't died over 400 years ago, they likely would have lived a normal life and died of natural causes around that time still, thus causing no need for the R system in the first place, a system which initial's purpose was to actually revive Zeref, and this likely would have led to Urza never finding out about her capabilities as far as her strength as a mage goes, seeing as she would have never met the guy, the grandpa or whatever, that turned her into the direction of Fairy Tail. And even if Urza did end up learning her capabilities as far as her being a mage goes, she still would have never found Fairy Tail, because as we established before, Fairy Tail would have never existed in the first place if not for Natsu's death. If Natsu never died over 400 years ago, it's likely that the effect it would have had on Gray's life would have been very minuscule, and in a way you could argue that Gray's life would have been better. At a very young age, Gray watches the demon Delior ravage his village, taking the lives of both his parents in return. However, if Natsu had died, then the demon Delior would have never existed to begin with, because it was one of the demons that Zeref actually created himself, so it's likely that Gray would have grown up with both of his parents in his life without any demons or anything coming to threaten his life and his parents. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, this could be seen as a bad thing as well, seeing as Gray likely would have never learned of his capabilities that he had as a mage, seeing as he never would have met who then as well, from what we saw within the Fairy Tail short story Ice Trail, would have never allowed for Gray to meet Guildarts, who then pointed him in the direction of Fairy Tail, where the rest became history. And the last majorly affected character that I want to discuss in this situation is Lucy Heartfilia, and oh boy, is this a major life changer for Lucy. In the case that Natsu never died over 400 years ago, for starters, in terms of Lucy, her mother, Layla Heartfilia, would have likely never died, in return causing the rift between Lucy and Jude to have never been caused. This is simply because of the fact that the 400-year plan devised by Zeref and Anna Heartfilia, Lucy and Layla's ancestor, would have never been created to begin with, thus never giving a reason for Layla to open the Eclipse Gate without one of the Eclipse Gate keys, which was the thing that in the end caused her death. As well, it's likely that Lucy would have never joined, or for that matter even heard of the Fairy Tail Guild if it even existed to begin with. This is because of the OVA 3, a canon OVA in which Natsu, Lucy, Urza, Gray, and Happy venture into the past, where they actually attempt to find out how Natsu got the scar on his neck hidden by the scarf. During this OVA, we see Lucy find out about Fairy Tail as a young child when she was saved by, well, Lucy. When her carriage goes rogue and loses control, Lucy then stops the carriage, thus saving herself as a young child. But during this, when she drops from the roof of the carriage down to the seats in the front to save herself, Lucy sees the guild mark on her hand. Later on, she sees the same guild mark on the banner that rests on a building and proceeds to ask one of the maids that actually comes to make sure she's alright what the marking represents. And when the maid replies that the guild mark represents the guild Fairy Tail, Lucy's future is set in stone. She's gonna join Fairy Tail. However, in the first place, if it weren't for Natsu's existence, they would have never traveled in the past. Therefore, Lucy would have never saved herself, and overall, Lucy would have never likely found out about the guild Fairy Tail again, if the guild were even to exist at the time. Looking at Natsu's death over 400 years ago now, it's really the catalyst for so much within the story of Fairy Tail. Nevertheless, though, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. Tell me in the comment section below how Natsu's death affected some other characters, some of your favorite characters, some of your least favorite characters. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and peace.